Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Courtside with Beilinson Tennis, part of the Tennis Channel Podcast Network. If I had to list all of the items our guest tonight has accomplished in the tennis and sports industry, it would take up the entire episode. But to just name a few, this guest was the first sports agent in professional tennis, representing players such as Arthur Ashe, Stan Smith, Jimmy Connors, and Ivan Lendl. He was the founder of ProServ, one of the first sports marketing firms established in 1970. He co-founded the ATP in 1972 with Jack Kramer and Cliff Drysdale. He's an author, a former Davis Cup player and Davis Cup captain, and was the co-founder of the Legg-Mason tournament held in Washington, D.C. And like my co-host, this guest was elected to the Tennis Hall of Fame in 2009. Please welcome to the pod, Mr. Donald Dell. Donald, thank you for spending time and talking to us about some of your incredible experiences in the tennis industry.
Thank you, David. Formerly, I might have been a pretty good guy, but I'm happy to be here.
No, I think you're still a damn good guy to us, and we're so looking forward to it. I think we're going to get into a ton of what you've done and all the amazing accomplishments throughout not only the tennis industry but the sports business industry as well. But to let us first start off with Novak and what he was trying to accomplish just a couple of weeks ago. I mean, you saw Rod Laver do it back in 1969. Steve and I have talked about this several times. We want to hear your thoughts. Just the journey Novak was on, and did you feel like when he finally made it to Sunday, all the hard work had been done and he was going to win that match, or did you feel like, whoa, he finally made it? The moment is right here in his face, and it may have the pressure may have been too much.
I think two things. I think, first of all, if all the players in the game were playing the very best they could at the same time, Djokovic is 20% better than the field. I really believe he's the best player in the world day in and day out on a combination of all surfaces. What happened that particular day, which is what makes sports great, I think the stress and the pressure was building all week. You can't imagine, unless you're out there playing, what it's like every time to say, well, only 3 more matches and you're going to be world champion. You won the Grand Slam. Nobody's done it since '69. And that kept building. And suddenly he starts out in the finals, and Medvedev is certainly 2 or 3 in the world, but he doesn't miss a ball. You don't get any cheap errors from him. So you have to go out and really beat him on every rally. You got to find a way to beat him on a slow cement court where all the stress and all the pressure is on you. And the match started with most of the fans for Medvedev to make it a good match. And then he won the first set. And slowly the crowd switched and then really wanted to cheer on Djokovic. But by that time, he's almost down 2 sets to love. He's lost a little bit of his confidence, and he's sitting there thinking to himself, I've spent 34 years, 18 years playing pro tennis since he was 16, and suddenly my dream is going out the window. And I think it's just a combination of so many things hit him stress-wise, and he was playing against a human backboard. I mean, you got to give Medvedev tremendous credit because he serves so damn well. He didn't break serve until 5-2 in the 3rd set. The match is virtually over at that time. He had two break of serve when Medvedev was serving at 5-1. So he broke him once, but he had to break him twice to get back even. And the mountain was just too high to climb, in my opinion, at that stage because of the confidence that switches in the match to Medvedev. Suddenly he's thinking, I'm going to win this match. And, the rest is history, as they say.
Yeah, Steve, you have anything on that? I mean, you and I have discussed this, a couple of times. I think it's really well said, Donald.
A good summation. I really do. And I only area I would just disagree. Who am I to disagree with Donald about anything? I would only have a slight disagreement. I felt that the crowd was really for Novak pretty much all the way through. We got a big ovation when he walked on the court. I felt they really wanted him, but they also, at the same time, they were so appreciative of Medvedev's performance. So they weren't an unfair crowd, but I felt like they had finally come round after starting off the tournament being giving Djokovic a hard time in the first few rounds, not terribly sympathetic to him, but it really grew over the fortnight. And by the time he got to the final, I felt they were with him. But Donald is absolutely right that they also cheered Medvedev on because they appreciated great play.
They wanted a good match. The crowd always likes the battle. They don't want a one-sided match. No, Steve, I think, if you listen to Djokovic's press conference afterwards, he said he found what he never had, which was crowd support, and that meant more to him than winning.
Right.
Now, I question that, but he certainly handled it great. I mean, certainly he wanted to win more than anything. He related and said, but the crowd support throughout the match made me prouder than winning the match.
Yeah, he did.
If you want to take him at his word, that's what he said.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I do take him at his word, and I was struck by that too. But I also think, Donald, that you touched on something else important. That yes, everybody talks about Novak's and the histrionics and smashing rackets and some volatility, but they don't give him nearly the credit, in my view, that he deserves for the way that he loses. This was not an unusual case to me. He goes up to the opponent, he hugs him, he talks to him, he doesn't just give him a cursory handshake. And then in the press conferences, he's invariably full of praise for what they have done while still being self-critical. And I frankly think on that count, he actually does better than either Federer or Nadal at acknowledging the opponent and being a good sport after the match is over.
Well, the simple fact is that really I think he's a great speaker. If you heard his speech after Wimbledon about the whole summary of the sport and the game and the event and the championship, it was a miraculous speech. And so I think he's a great thinker, and I think he's a great player, and I think he's a great speech maker. I really do think he's articulate.
No doubt about it.
All right, enough about Novak. We want to hear, you're our guest. We want to hear about you. So if you don't mind, why don't you kind of give us a background on, where did you grow up? How'd you get started in this game? How'd you get interested in this game? And then we'll get into all the extraordinary accomplishments that you've done.
Well, David, I was very lucky. I grew up in Washington, D.C., and I lived right across the street, literally 50 yards from a clay court tennis club called the Edgemoor Club, which is a swimming and tennis club, small, 7 courts, a swimming pool, and the neighborhood is called the Edgemoor area. And it's not a golf club. Everybody plays tennis there, and it became, and has been over time, the #1 tennis club in Washington because it's very popular, and they have a resolution in their board that first of all, if you live in Edgemoor, you can get in the club right away. But if you're ranked in the top 20 or 30 in the city as a tennis player, you can get right into the club. So conversely, all the best players play there. And I was a kid, 6 years old. My mother, took me across the street and hit some balls with me. And I used to play against the backboard by the hour. And then I started playing against the different club members. And as I got to be 8 and 10 and started playing better, the membership of the Edgemoor Club really encouraged me a great deal and helped me learn to play. And as I got better, when I was 12, I was 13. When I was 13 years old, I was #3 in the United States in the 15 and under. So I was a very good player, very young. And then I would go over there. I might play 4 of the different men during the day. In the summer, I might play 6 or 8 hours when I was a kid growing up. And so that's how I really got started. It was a wonderful experience. But I remember I lived 50 yards from that club right across the street. In Washington, it's in Bethesda, Maryland, a suburb of Washington.
Oh, super cool, super convenient too. You didn't have to worry about getting a ride over there. I mean, literally walking distance. So definitely plays a part in it. Steve and I just recorded our Laver Cup recap. We released it, and we talked a little bit about how Davis Cup is getting lost in the shuffle a little bit, unfortunately, with a number of these team events and the restructuring. And I know. I want to hear about your experience, not only playing it, but also coaching it, because I believe you won the cup. Your teams won the cup in 68 and 69, right?
Yeah, we did. The American team had lost the Davis Cup 5 years in a row against some bad teams, Ecuador, Peru, a lot of different South American teams on clay. And we just had a very bad record when they asked me to be the captain in 1968. And before I was working in Washington, I'd been a lawyer for a short 2 years. I retired in 66. The last match I played on competitive tournaments was at Fort Worth, Texas in September against a little known but great server named Arthur Ashe. And he beat me 4-6. And I was out of the tournament. And I thought, it's time to go back. I'd gone to law school after being at Yale. And then I went to Virginia Law School. I thought, I'm never going to be the best player. There's no money in the sport. So I went back and took a job with a big law firm in Washington, Hogan and Hartson. And then about 2 years later, I started working with Sergeant Schreiber as his special assistant at OEO in the Peace Corps. And suddenly, out of the blue, Bob Keller called and asked me if I'd be Davis Cup captain. I was 29 years old. And before I took the job, because I loved working with Schreiber, I didn't really want to give that up. But we had to play in that year in 68, 6 countries to get to the final round to play the Australians. And then if we won that in 69, we played in the challenge round where we were the defending champion. We only had to play one match. So I went to Arthur Ashe and to Charlie Passerell, who in 67 was number one in the United States. He was the number one player. And I went to Charlie and his roommate, Arthur Ashe at UCLA, And I said to both of them, look, if I'm going to give up my job to become the Davis Cup captain, I wasn't married. I was going to travel with the team. We had 6 matches for over about a 4.5-month, 5-month period. I said, I don't want to do that unless you guys are really going to make this a mission, that to win it back after 5 years and all the bad press American tennis has gotten, if you'll give me a commitment, I'll do it. So I worked. Remember, I was the youngest captain at 29 ever picked. So I had a good relationship with these players, and they all committed to spend the whole year trying to win the Davis Cup. The first thing I did as captain, very politely, I called Pancho Gonzalez, who had been the coach of the team for about 4 years. And I said, Pancho, I'd really appreciate it if you would say you're unavailable this year as the coach. I loved Pancho. I said, I don't want to in any way fire you I just want you to say, would you mind? I want to pick a really young coach. And he was great about it. He was a teaching pro out in Las Vegas at the hotel there. And he said, no, if that's what you want, I'm out of it. That's fine. He didn't really care. He was a pro and he was playing the tour with Kramer and Hode and Rosewall and these other players. And so I then hired Dennis Ralston, who was 26 years old at the time, to be my coach. And he was sensational. And so Dennis ran the team and I ran the policies and the decisions and the politics of the whole thing. And we were a great team, and he was a wonderful, wonderful friend. And that really got us started. And when we won the Davis Cup in Australia, in Adelaide, Steve, we beat Harry Hopman in his last great match in 68. Now, in fairness to the Australians, there was a fight going on between the federations to control the players. And some of the best Australians couldn't play Davis Cup unless they registered with their federation. And Laver and Hode and Rosewall and those guys and Emerson, they weren't going to say, they've been pros for 6 or 7 years. The game went open in 68. So they could play Wimbledon, the US Open for prize money. So they all said, we're not going to do that. So the Australians didn't have the strongest team they've had in the past. And we won that match 4-1. And then in 69, we defended against the Romanians, who had a very strong team, Tiriac and Ilie Nastase. Ilie Nastase could beat anybody at a given day on any court. And we survived that very strongly and won that match in the challenge round 5-0. So, and then that December of 69, I decided to retire as the captain. I'm the only one that never lost because the captain stayed too long. And I wanted to get in and get out and do something else. And that's when I decided to think about representing tennis players. Arthur said to me, I took Arthur, Steve, if you can believe it, I took Arthur to Mark McCormick, the head of IMG, 4 times. Yeah, 4 times to go with him. And we were, after the 4th breakfast, we were driving down the east side of New York City. And Arthur turned to me in a taxi cab and said, why don't you do it? And I said, do what? He said, why don't you manage me and represent me? You're a lawyer. You know, we could start a business. And I said, Arthur, I don't want to do that. I'm going to go back to my law firm in Washington, Hogan. I want to be a trial lawyer. I want to be the next Clarence Darrow. And he said, well, you know, if you did it, I think Stan would join us, Stan Smith, and the three of us, we could have a business and be kind of fun. So I went back to Hogan Hearts and asked the chief senior partner, Lester Cohen, what he thought of the idea of managing athletes, particularly tennis players. He said, it's a great idea. The sport's going open. It's gone public. There's going to be big money. We'll give you the fifth floor. We'll give you tax attorneys. We'll give you accountants. And then I said, what would be the name of the firm? He said, Hogan and Hartson. I said, well, let me think about it. And I did for about 2 or 3 weeks. And then I decided, and I called him, and I opened the law office of Donald Dell, which was me and one secretary. And my 2 clients were Arthur Ashe and Stan Smith. So I was very lucky, and it's very much timing.
Donald, I want to go back, make you go back for just a second, if you don't mind, because
Sure.
you know, David, Donald's kind of modest about this, but there's a couple of things that stand out to me about his Davis Cup captaincy that he didn't tell you. Yes, he was young. Yes, he was 29. He had to navigate some difficult territory because he was closer to Arthur and to Charlie Passerelle and to Stan Smith and Bob Lutz, but his number 2 singles player that year was Clark Graebner. And he didn't have the same relationship personally with Clark that he did with the others. But to me, it was a testament to Donald's leadership that Graebner, who had played very well and was the number 2 man behind Arthur and had been in the semis of Wimbledon and the US Open, lost to Arthur in the semifinals of the Open. And there was a book written about that called Levels of the Game by John McPhee. But in any case, Clark in the fall, when they were getting ready to play in Australia and they're playing some events over there, he was not playing well, and there was questions about tanking a doubles match, and Donald, I'll let him fill in the gaps here, but Donald was ready to send him home and throw him off the team. And Clark kind of, the story that Donald's told me, and I think I've heard this from both sides, Clark kind of pleaded with him, you can't do that. My father will kill me. You just cannot do that. And he allowed Graebner to play challenge matches against the others. Arthur's position was cemented. Everybody knew he was number 1. The question was who's going to be 2. But he played the others. He played Smith. He played Passerelle. He played to beat them all and earned his position back. And Graebner ended up actually being one of the heroes over there because he won both of his matches. Arthur lost on the last day. We'd already clinched it. But still, what I'm saying with that story is that to me proved why Donald was one of the great Davis Cup captains we've had, because of the leadership and because of the fundamental fairness in allowing somebody that maybe he didn't get along with as well as some of the others to a totally fair shake, because Graebner had played so well all year until that home stretch in Australia. And now he'd gone off and he wasn't competing well, but he went out in those practice matches and earned it back. And that to me, was a very, that said a lot about Donald as a captain. And I followed all that very closely as a 16-year-old, but I was really impressed with how Donald handled what could have been a difficult situation. And in the end, and Donald, you remember the story you told me, a great story where Donald, David, went out for a run with Charlie Passerelle. They're in the rain. They stop under a tree.
Let me say, stop right there, Steve Roman. This was the hardest thing I ever had to do that whole year of Davis Cup, because Charlie Passerelle was my dearest friend on the team because I knew him the best. And we had the match coming up. The draw was being made in an hour. And I say to I say to Clark, you all go out and practice. Charlie, let you and I go for a run. And we're running around that big field in Adelaide. And Charlie, suddenly it starts raining like crazy, a flood. And we jump under 2 trees. And Charlie looks at me and says, Donald, what the hell are we doing out here running right now? He says, you're going to pick Graebner and drop me. Under the rules, we could only have a 4-man team in those days to play. And he said, and Charlie was the 4th man on the team. He said, you're going to pick Graebner and drop me from the team, aren't you? And I honestly, I didn't almost know how to say. I said, yes, Charlie, I am. And he said, well, I understand. And I was almost in tears, but I said, Charlie, you have to understand one thing. I've given myself to this for a whole year, and all I care about is winning. And Graebner has been beating everybody. We used to play, Dennis Ralston was very strong on this. We used to give 2 weeks of practice and training to these matches, which you can't do now with the world schedule. Davis Cup has really dropped off the scene. But back in 68 and 69, it was like the Ryder Cup. It was very, very important to different countries, home and home away. And I just felt so strongly that Grabner was beating these other players in our practice matches. And we were playing, Steve, in some places, 3 out of 5 set matches.
Yeah.
And so I said to Charlie, Grabner's playing the best. Arthur's been shaky, hasn't played that well. And he lost the match to Bowery down there, Bill Bowery, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
And so it was a very tough call. And Charlie took it great, but it was really a terrible moment when he looked at me under that tree and it was raining. And I said, no, that's what I want to do. The draw is going to be in an hour. He said, okay. And Charlie was he's the best in the game as a human being. And so that's how we did it. And we got lucky. Grabner played a hell of a 2 matches. He won both singles and he was the hero of that particular tie. And I give him full credit for it. He was a difficult guy. He did throw a doubles match. I thought tanked it in Australia with Charlie as his partner, and that made me mad as hell. So I wanted to send him home, and he pleaded with me not to. Steve told the story; it's accurate. But anyway, to his credit, he really worked his butt off, and he deserved to play, and he won. And we won.
You have to tell the story to David and our listeners. Going to the White House in January of '69. He brings all these guys to the White House. So the team's invited to meet Nixon, who's just been elected. And I want Donald to explain that some of his team members didn't want to necessarily go along with the dress code. And one member didn't want to get his hair cut. I think that was Bob Lutz. Tell the story, Donald, of how you.
Well, what happened was we had come back after we won the Davis Cup. We were coming back in we won it in December of '68. We went through Vietnam and did a 5-day tour there with Army, went to hospitals, to the Army and so forth. And then we went to Hawaii and got a little rest, and we played some exhibitions there at Punahou School and some other places in Hawaii for a couple of days. And then we took an all-night flight back to DC, and we arrived the morning to be in the White House for lunch with President Nixon. And we got in literally like 6 a.m. in the morning. And Bob Kelleher, the president who had appointed me, was a very strong Republican, was on the plane with us. And when we landed at the airport, we were getting the bags. Bob came over to me and said, "My God, Donald, you can't take this team to the White House. They're all scraggly and they're all in different clothes." I said, "Wait, Bob, we're going to go to a hotel. We're going to rest. We're going to change clothes. Just stay out of it. Let me handle them." So we go to the hotel, and Lutz says, I'm not, I said, "Bob, you got to cut your hair." He hadn't cut his hair in weeks. And I said, "You got to cut your hair." And he said, "No, I'm not cutting my hair. I'm not going to do that." So, "Well, then you're not going to the press conference or the lunch. You take a pick." Now, Lutz was one of the younger players. So then I turned to Charlie, and Charlie said, "I'm not wearing a coat and tie, Don. I don't wear a coat and tie." I said, "Charlie, let me explain something to you. You and Arthur are in the Army, and your service orders are written to me as the captain of the team. You can do whatever you want. If you don't want to wear a coat and tie, I understand. But there's going to be a press conference, and you're not going to be there, and they're going to ask me why you're not there. And I'm going to tell them because you didn't want to attend the president and put on a tie. And I don't know what's going to happen to those Army orders." And he said, where do I get a white shirt, damn it? And so we solved those 2 problems. And Bob Kelleher was quickly astounded and amazed that we rejuvenated everybody. And we went to lunch. And Steve, you may not know this, but there were 2 things that happened to that lunch that were remarkable. We went in and had lunch with the president, and he honestly did not know much about tennis. And they had warned me that ahead of time and said, "Would you sit down at the end of the table and, work the players in and carry the conversation?" Bob Kelleher was at the other end from the president. I was sitting to the right of him. And we were there, I would say, for probably about 90 minutes. There was not one phone call, interruption, or anything for 90 minutes. And when we walked out the door, outside the door, there were about 8 or 10 people lined up waiting to ask the president or tell the president certain things. I have no idea what they were, but I will never forget how isolated and insulated we were with only people serving lunch. And that stunned me. And then secondly, when we went to leave the White House, we got some gifts from the White House. And as we left, the irony of it was the gifts were 4 White House golf balls for each player. And that always struck me as kind of unusual that they gave us golf balls to a Davis Cup tennis team. But President Nixon could not have been more hospitable, more gracious. I mean, and it was remarkable because we were never and nobody bothered us for an hour and a half. And that
Amazing.
always surprised me. And I'll tell you one quick more story, Steve.
Yeah.
The next year when we beat Romania in Cleveland, Jan Tiriac was on that team. And what is little known is that he was defaulted in the 5th match. We were 4 up and he wouldn't come out at about 4:30 in Cleveland. He was mad because they were getting beat. And he said to the referee, if you can picture this, the referee of the match was Philippe Chatrier, the president of the French Federation.
Yeah.
And so I'm over talking to Stan Smith, who's playing the match. He's up 2-1, and Tiriac won't come out. And so I guess Philippe warns him. Suddenly, Philippe puts on a raincoat, walks over to me and says, Donald, the match is over. And I'm talking to Smith on the changeover. I said, what are you talking about? He said, I've just defaulted Tiriac. He's told me he's not going to play. So the next morning, I mean, think of timing in life. The next morning, I get a phone call, put the Romanians on the private charter. We're all flying to Washington. We're going to go to the White House and meet President Nixon a second time in the Rose Garden. So I get on the plane and we're flying into from Cleveland to Washington, and Tiriac comes up to me. Now, this story I want told because Tiriac will deny it. And he looks at me and he says, Donald, you cannot tell the prime minister or the president that I was defaulted, because what happened was the prime minister of Romania was there that day, Ceausescu, who was assassinated with his wife a months later. And that's why they had called me in the State Department and said, make sure the Romanians are on the team with you, on the plane with you, and come in together. So Tiriac's on the plane. He knew that. And he said, I'll never get out of the country again if you tell them that I was defaulted. I said, well, I'd like you to stay in your country forever. I was kidding him and needling him. He turned white on the airplane. We get there to the Rose Garden, and Alistair Martin was the president that year of the USTA. Bob Kelleher had his 2-year term. Alistair was president, and he was a very shy, introverted type of person. So he says to me, Donald, I want you to walk down with the president and the prime minister of Romania, introducing the players. Say a couple of words about each one of them. So we start with the American team in the Rose Garden, and the prime minister of Romania standing there with Nixon and myself. We go down the list of people, and finally we get to the Romanians. And of course, Nastasi's waving his arms and laughing. We get to Tiriac, and I'm saying a word about each one. And I said to the prime minister, Mr. Prime Minister, Jan Tiriac, as you may know, was a great ice hockey hero in Romania, one of the great ones. And the prime minister sort of nodded. Now remember, prime ministers, and it's an iron curtain country in those days. That's what the revolution was about later, that assassinated him. And so I turned to him, I said, but he's a great sportsman, a tremendous fighter in tennis, and really makes the country proud of you. And Tiriac shakes his hand. And later that day, I said, Tiriac, you owe me for life. Not for now, but for life. He always denies that story, but those that were standing in that line know exactly what I said.
Donald, just quickly, Donald, because you've mentioned so much about Nixon, but I think just so the listeners can understand, talk about your friendship with Bobby Kennedy, working for Robert Kennedy, the assassination, and how that might have changed your life because you might have gone into politics yourself.
Well, it was funny. In '68, when I was working for Sergeant Shriver, I had met Bobby out at Hickory Hill. They lived across the river in Virginia. And again, as I say, I wasn't married in those days, and I was a lawyer at Hogan and Hartson. I was playing on the weekends with Bobby and Ethel, and I tried to help Bobby with his backhand and get to know him. And suddenly, in 66, I was asked to maybe do a few stops as an advance man for Bobby in an off-year election. He wasn't running. In 68. At the very latest in March, he decided to run. And another lawyer in Washington named John Nolan, who was his scheduler and who would have, in my judgment, he was the head of a big law firm, Steptoe and Johnson in Washington. I think John would have been attorney general had Bobby lived and won. And so I was asked to take over 5 states for Bobby Kennedy in 68. They were Oregon, California, West Virginia, and the District of Columbia. And so I ran 5 states for him with what's called the lead advance. And I had people who were advancing in each state for me. And in California, I took him into Watts, and I took Arthur Ashe on the back end of a train the day before the primary election in Los Angeles and California. He won that. And one of my stops was the Ambassador Hotel where he was assassinated. And really, I had planned to go into politics. If Bobby had won, he and I had talked about I'd work in his staff in the White House maybe for 2 or 4 years. He'd come out, do 1 or 2 dinners in Bethesda, and raise money for me to run for Congress. And that's what I was at least thinking about if I'd gone to work in the White House. I don't think I would have ever run or started ProServ, and if he had won. And of course, he was assassinated, and that just sort of changed my whole. I was pretty terribly disappointed and crushed when that happened, and decided that I wanted to really spend time trying to build a company. And that's when I started ProServ. And well, actually, it was a law firm in 1970. It's called Dell, Craighill, Fentress, and Benton. 4 of us were partners. And in 86, we decided to make it called, it was still a law firm, but we had the marketing arm was called ProServ, because under the canons of ethics in the law firm, we couldn't do certain things like recruit or work in insurance or work in advertising, or all kinds of canons of ethics that lawyers had to honor. And so we changed it to a business company called ProServ. And that's really, I think it's because of the assassination that I ended up in sports on a major basis, full time.
It's amazing. In anyone's lives, there's maybe 1, 2, or 3 moments in each individual's life that really turns their direction in one way or the other. And thank you for sharing that. And you talk about ProServ, and I mean, this got really, really big. I mean, at its peak, it had 16 offices around the world, 300 employees. This was a little bit bigger than the law offices of Donald Dell with yourself and 1 assistant. You represented more than 200 athletes and coaches, including Michael Jordan. Shout out, I'm a Chicago guy, so I'm an MJ guy. Patrick Ewing, Patrick Ewing, Steve's Knicks, Arthur Ashe, Jimmy Connors, Gabriella Sabatini, and Pete Sampras, among others. I mean, this was a hugely successful company. Did you ever imagine it getting that big?
Well, I never thought it would get that big. And tennis, of course, kept growing, and the NBA kept growing. I love basketball. Nobody would remember it, but I played basketball for 2 years at Yale. I was the freshman captain of the team, and I was high scorer as a freshman. I played varsity for part of the second year, and then I got mononucleosis twice. But I loved basketball. So when I started ProServ, we started and really centered on tennis to begin with, but quickly moved into basketball in the ACC. I had a very good working relationship with Dean Smith. I managed with the coaches. I tried to get relationships with and build them with coaches. And I mean, I had great players with, Michael being the greatest. And of course, then we had James Worthy from Carolina, Phil Ford, Tommy Lagarde. We got every really good player out of North Carolina for 14 years. I had Ralph Sampson and Wally Walker from Virginia. And so basketball became the second biggest sport in our company. And then we moved into Olympic sports. And at our height, really in the 80s and 90s, we had about 300 employees around the world in 16 offices. And that sounds great until you have to fly to, Sydney, Australia, or Hong Kong, which I loved, or, Paris and London, but you travel all the time. And I can't imagine doing that now, but I ran ProServ for 27 years. Our biggest competitors really was IMG and Mark McCormick. Our staffs were very competitive with each other. He was about Well, he had 1,000 employees and about 26 offices. So he was a lot bigger than we were. But he and I became very good friends privately. I liked Mark a lot. I admired what he had done, the way he had done it. And so he and I really worked together in some ways in the sports marketing. We had a company called ProServ Television. We did 24 Olympic events one year, pre-events and leading into the Olympics, and awful lot of sports television suddenly exploded with cable. And I was lucky again, because the timing of it came at the right time, but it was a great experience, a lot of fun. And I'm still working full-time now for a company in Europe called Sport 5. It's a global company, and I do more television and sponsorship and marketing. I don't really do much in the talent area. I could be the grandfather of some of these players, but they're awfully exciting. I mean, the women's final was as good a excitement as you're going to see. And I thought this year, in a strange way, the women not only added to the tournament, but in a way carried the tournament. I mean, they were really, the people got excited. People thought Djokovic was going to roll over and win everything. They didn't think and realize how good Medvedev is. And don't underestimate Medvedev. He's a great player. I mean, and he really has improved his first serve. That was the key to that match. But the finals between Fernandez and Emma, I'll never forget that. I had somebody send me a note, Steve, from Wimbledon, and it was about some things with the chairman. And then at the bottom it said, P.S. cheer hard for Emma on the bottom of this note. And I thought, when she won it, I hear she's taken over England. She's gone crazy over there. But can you imagine? Steve knows tennis so well. She ran through and qualified, got to the finals as a qualifier, won the tournament, and never lost a set.
Never lost a set.
I mean,
and never even went into a tiebreaker, Donald. Just astounding.
It's like a fairy tale. It really is a fairy tale.
Donald, again, I got to get you to go back to one other area, and I know David will enjoy hearing about this, but the mid 70s was a golden period for the sport, with the Connors and Borg and Everett and McEnroe coming along. And in that period and beyond, you were doing a lot of commentary. And to me, the most enjoyable commentary was when you and Bud Collins would do it for PBS and do the weekends with Monday night finals across the summer at all the American tournaments, and long interviews with the players. They'd come up to the booth for 15, 20 minutes, Donald. But talk about that period in the game and the enjoyment you got from the commentary, because you were awfully good at it. And that was a wonderful time to be doing work in television along with your representing players. But I would think that this was a really night, more than a diversion, but a very enjoyable experience for you. Reflect on that a bit.
Well, I think, Bud Collins, as you know, is a great historian and friend of tennis. Wonderful. Bud and I had one thing in common. It's funny. We had the same birthday, the two of us, June 17th. He was exactly 10 years older than I was, and he was a great friend. And we did something that was quite unusual, and we did it ahead of really a Monday Night Football. A couple of years before there was any Monday Night Football, I was able to manage to get the 6 summer tournaments the weekend after Wimbledon, leading into the US Open. There's a 6 or 7 week time period. It rotates sometime with the calendar, because Wimbledon was always the 3rd week in June. But I got all the tournaments. Now you got to remember, most of these tournaments were on grass at the time. There was Newport, Marion, Orange, Southampton. These were all grass court tournaments. Then they changed the cement. They changed the clay for a while, and then they became cement, which is today's game at the Open. But when we were doing that, when Bud and I were doing it, we got all 6 of these tournaments to agree to play the finals on Monday night. And we had Greg Harney and WGBH in Boston, Channel 2 with PBS. And Bud he was the host. I'd do the color. And we'd end up, in 4-hour shows on Monday night. Now think about that for a moment. 4 hours, no advertising. If you wanted to go to the bathroom in the middle of the show, you'd sort of throw the mic to Bud, which he loved because he loved to talk. And then you'd run out the door, run back and hope you weren't missed. But it was really great for the sport. And I remember one year we got to the finals in Louisville, Kentucky in late July. And on the Monday night, it poured rain. I mean, it rained and rained and rained. So early on, about 7:00, 7:15, they canceled the whole finals, singles and doubles. And I looked at Bud and wrote him a note and said, well, we have 4 hours to fill, not 5 minutes, and no ads. And Bud said, that'll be great. And Bud had a phenomenal ability to create stuff and talk. Like, he developed Fingers Fortescue, who would be the guy on the net. We used to get letters and calls asking questions about Fingers, who was just made up. He just where does he live? How old is he? Does he like tennis? And Bud loved all that. And Steve, it was one of the great losses for tennis when we lost Bud about 3 or 4 years ago. And also, I did Wimbledon on NBC for 5 years with Bud Collins,
right.
Dick Enberg, and some others. But Bud and I really were a team.
I have great memories of that as well, because I was fortunate enough, David, to often be behind the scenes as a statistician, both on PBS and then the NBC telecast that Donald's talking about. I would be with them in the booth, and Donald was always very creative, because I would do the standard stats, but he would almost always come to me with something special. Like, okay, I want you to tell me what percentage of returns is Borg getting back into play? He'd come up with things that he wanted, that he was going to make part of his commentary, that were different than the normal stats. But it just gave me this ringside seat between these two great announcers and two great figures in tennis.
And when you think about it, you mentioned Borg, think about it for a moment. Bjorn Borg won the French Open on 6 consecutive times. And at the same time, 3 weeks later, he won Wimbledon on grass 5 years in a row.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Incredible.
And nobody realizes how tough that is to go from clay. Nadal, who's a great player, won the French 12 times, but he didn't win Wimbledon 4 or 5 times in a row.
And the grass back when Borg was playing was totally different than when it's playing now, even more harder.
Much faster. And you take Federer. Federer's the greatest player, and he won Wimbledon 4 or 5 times. He won Wimbledon, I think, 6 times maybe, but he wasn't winning the French but once. So you really got to figure out Borg. I thought, Steve, the greatest thing about Borg, which people don't remember, was his quickness on his feet, his footwork. That's what really made him a great player, and his ability to concentrate.
Oh, you're so right. And yet it's so strange looking back. He should have won the Open, Donald. He lost to Connors on the clay at Forest Hills in a great 4-setter in 76, and a couple of finals to McEnroe at Flushing Meadows, one to Jimmy as well. It's kind of sad. I felt like he should have had that on his record. And had he managed to do it one of those years, 78 to 80, when he was winning all the French and Wimbledon back to back, he then would have gone on to Australia trying to go for his Grand Slam, because Australia was at the end of the year. So I thought that was too bad, Donald, because to me, he was that great a player, and I wish we'd seen it happen.
Well, Steve, I don't know the total accuracy of this story, but I believe it's true. When he lost the last match in the finals, I thought it was to Connors. It could have been to McEnroe at the U.S. Open. He left the court, went to the airport in his tennis clothes, and got on a plane and flew home to Sweden, and then retired.
Yeah, you're right, Don. It was McEnroe, and you know what? To McEnroe's credit, he was not happy about that, Donald. He really wished Borg had hung around. They had their great rivalry, 7-7 against each other. It could have been a rivalry that went on for 5 to 10 more years, or at least 5 more.
But how old was Borg when he did that? He retired very young.
At 25.
25.
Yeah.
I mean, that's ridiculous.
That's crazy.
That was a great loss for the tennis, for the game.
It was.
It really was.
Donald, I need to and I don't want to cut any of these topics short, because I don't know how you would, but I have to ask you about these two things. One, being a co-founder of the ATP Tour in 1972 with Jack Kramer and Cliff Drysdale, and then your involvement with the Legg-Mason tournament, now named the City Open, as people know. If you can kind of talk about both those, again, your involvement and what that has meant, the obvious impact to the sport of tennis, that'd be amazing.
Well, I think 2 things. One, with the players, first of all, Jack Kramer was a great hero of mine, and we became very good friends. I was like a little younger brother to Jack. He was about 10 years older than I was. And I admired him greatly as a player and as a businessman in the sport. And he and I became good friends over a period of time. And we were talking, we said, the federations are still trying to control the game after 68 when it went open. There were a lot of fights going on. And we said, everybody's fighting for things, but the players have no voice. Why don't we try and, decide about a players union? And so I'll never forget, as long as I live, outside of, in those days, we were still playing on grass at Forest Hills for the Open. And one day, Jack and I were standing there, and Jack had been a vice president of Southern Cal Tennis Association. And someone had come to him and said, look, if you'll go into the USTA and be a vice president in 2 years, you will be the president of the USTA. And that was a great honor to Jack, because he had always felt that he had been sort of looked down on as a pro when he was signing the top players, when the amateurs were running the sport. And I spent 2 hours one day at the West Side Tennis Club, off in a little room, arguing with Jack, just the two of us, why I didn't want him to take the presidency and instead start a players union. And he said, all right, finally, we were great friends. I love Jack Kramer. He's one of my hero in tennis. And he said, all right, I'll try to do the Players Association, and I want you to be, my general counsel, but I'm going to work for $1 a year. And so I worked for 8 years as his counsel for $1 of the year. And Pierre Darmon ran Europe for us when we started at $1 a year. And that's just the way Jack was. And so in 72, we started the ATP, founded it, because we thought the players needed a fair voice in the sport. That was really Jack's idea. And Cliff Drysdale had a big hand in that conceptually, and then leading it as the first president, did it damn well. And then, of course, the first controversy he had was the Pilic case at Wimbledon, 73. And Nicky had refused to play Davis Cup for Yugoslavia. In fact, I think he was playing an event for WCT in America, and he didn't play Davis Cup. So the ITF, which was still sort of the governing body of the sport, certainly in Europe, went to Philippe Chatrier and said, we don't want you to accept, we're in the federation, Yugoslavia, you're the president, we don't want you accepting him to the French Open. Philippe, whose greatest friend was Jack Kramer, just privately ignored, like he never got the letter. Pilic played the French, and Steve knows this. Pilic was not a clay court player. He's a big left-handed server. He's a great server, big hitter. He gets to the finals of the French Open. I mean, I don't know how he did. I don't remember the draw, but he loses it in the finals of the French Open. 2 weeks later, we're on grass in England, where he's going to be a damn good player. And suddenly Wimbledon says, we're going to accept the recommendation of the ITF, and we're not going to accept him into the tournament. And so the board of the ATP, really led by Cliff and John Newcomb and Arthur and Stan, they've spent the week of Queens trying to figure out, and they decided they wouldn't play if Pilic couldn't play. And 80 people withdrew from the tournament. The tournament went ahead, thinking that would never happen, made the draw with the players in the draw. And we had to call them on that Saturday. They made the draw on Friday, and Saturday morning we called and said, if Pilic is not in the draw, we're not going to be able to do it. And then here are the names. And we started pulling the names out, John Newcomb, Tony Roach, Ken Rosewall,
80 people? 80 people.
80 people pulled out, and they then had to make the draw over. And the irony of all this was that two things happened. Number one, the fans in England, the press had killed us and made us look like villains. The fans came out for the tournament in the greatest amount of volume, and they never had record crowds like that. So the fans all supported Wimbledon without the 80 players. But on the other hand, as Jack said to me one day after it was over, he said, we lost the battle, but we won the war. And what he meant was, and he explained it, he said, the players now are really united, and the game is going to pay attention to us, because to walk away from Wimbledon, think about it for a second. And Steve knows it so well. Stan Smith was the defending champion in 1973. He won it in 72, beating Nastasi in 5 sets. And yet, for the first time in the history of Wimbledon, unless there was a war or a famine or something going on, everybody defended their title, and Stan did not. And that was a record of real character and determination to support the players union that he had helped start. And as a result of that, every player of those 80 players felt very strongly about the ATP because they had skin in the game. They had given up something. And so to me, that was an awfully big turning point and really strengthened the ATP. And immediately the people, the administrators of the sport came back to Jack and I and said, look, let's do a men's pro council, and we'll have 3 players, 3 tournaments, and 3, quote, tennis administrators. You can elect your player representatives, but Jack, you can have a hand in selection of the administrators, because we wanted quality, knowledgeable people on the administrators, and the tournament directors were elected by the tournaments. So we started a thing called the Men's Pro Council, which ran from about 74 until 89, when Hamilton Jordan came in the ATP and started a new tour, because by then Jack and I had moved on, and the game had come back to coagulate, and the federations were fighting with the players again, and they wanted to do some things with the US Open. And he decided, who needed them? We're going to start, the ATP is going to start their own tour. And that's what created the ATP Tour today, which is not a players only union. It's a partnership between tournaments and players.
Yeah. I mean, I would guess the next logical question is the state of the union of the tennis world today, right? I mean, we don't have a commissioner of tennis. We now have the PTPA that Novak and Vasek are trying to
And David, but Donald, that's what's important. What Donald was just saying is that's why there's sort of an opening for what Djokovic is trying to accomplish there, because they want it to be a total players group.
100% agree. 100% agree. And I think, and Donald, I'll ask you, and before we end with the Legg-Mason tournament, I'll ask you, any thoughts on the PTPA and what Novak and Vasek are trying to do?
Well, I listened to their press conference one night I guess it was about 6 weeks ago, and trying to learn about it. I think Djokovic is very sincere in his efforts. He wants, among other things, to get more direct representation for the players. He also wants to build prize money for more people in the lower levels. And that gets back to an important question. When Jack and I were starting it, we always asked the question for a couple of years, how many players can the sport of pro tennis support for a good living? And when we started it in the 70s, we really felt probably 100, 125. But the game has exploded since then. And so now, just for interest, I called 3 or 4 of my best friends who are player agents that deal with players every day. Steve would know all of them. And the 3 or 4 of them came back and said to me the same question: how many players can the game really afford to have a good living? And the number they came up with is 275 to 300. Now, the question is, and this is an age-old one. Today, everyone talks about his team. He's got 4 or 5 helpers. He's got a coach. He's got a manager. He's got a physio. He's got some even have, people planning their meals and their dietitian. So most players can't afford that. And I don't think the game can afford all of that. But coaches are important. And so a lot of the mid-level players, let's say you're ranked 125 or 147, and you're saying, how do I get from there to the top 100? I'd like to have a coach, but I can't really afford one. Jack's answer to that, and he was a true pro. Remember, he's #1 in the world. His answer to that would be play better or get a job a couple of years from now out of the sport. And he really felt that. The game has gotten bigger and bigger now. There are 900 players, I think, on the ATP computer ranking. And so to support 300 seems to me reasonable. And that's really what Djokovic is all about, I think. And what I've tried to convey, and I've written this a couple of times, I wrote an article in Sports Illustrated about a week ago, saying, I hope, rather than have a players union, the PTPA as it's called, rather than trying to dilute or weaken the strength of the ATP Tour, because there's a lot of very good things about the ATP Tour. Problem is tournaments, players have different interests. In a partnership, it's very hard. The players want more prize money and less tournaments. The tournaments want just the result. They want, better players committed and maybe less events around the world. So there's a conflict there. But I'm hoping that, and I think Djokovic is very intelligent, very smart. And I've suggested in writing that, build your association, make it strong, but sit down and with the tour board leaders, people managing it, and come up with some real reforms, because you can make it a lot better and bigger. Because remember, the tour board now has been going on for 30 years. It's another world. And they have about 120 employees, and I don't know what the total budget is. The overhead is quite substantial. So it's a business, and they're very successful in television revenue and endorsements. So you're not going to get rid of them, but find a way the two parties can strengthen what the players really want, which is equal and full representation and better playing conditions. It's that simple. It's very hard to do. It's easy to describe it. Very hard to do.
Yeah, well said. No, I was curious to hear your thoughts, and I appreciate you adding your insight to it. We will end with the discussion on Legg-Mason, because it's such a successful tournament. Again, it's now, I think it was Legg-Mason from 1994 to 2011. Now it's named the City Open. You had such huge involvement in that. I want to end the conversation with it. Talk a little bit about how that tournament came about and what that tournament means to you.
Well, we were very lucky in Washington. Johnny Harris and I, Johnny was a great friend of mine, was a very good player in junior and men's tennis, played at Michigan. He and I started a tournament in 69. And really, Arthur had a big hand in that, Arthur Ashe. We were running the Davis Cup, and we were driving around Washington one time in 1968 after a clinic or tennis exhibition downtown. And Arthur said, why don't we try to start a tournament in Washington? But I'd really like you to put it into a facility where it's totally integrated, or where it's naturally integrated, and not in a country club. Well, the best facility for that was 16th and Kennedy, which is a public park. And so Arthur said, if you'll start a tournament there, I'll play it. And he played it 10 years in a row. So he honored his commitment. And so Johnny and I started a tournament in 69, and we ran it 69, 70, and 71. And it was on the tour, on the, what became the ATP tour. It was a tournament even before that. And we were the first ones in 69. We put up $25,000 in prize money ahead of the grass court tournaments, and sort of forced them to come up with $25,000 each week leading to the Open. We were the first one after Wimbledon. And in 1972, Johnny and I decided to give the sanction and the date of the tournament to the Washington Tennis and Education Foundation, the WTEF in Washington. And so we transferred everything to them, and they became the owner of the tournament. We ran the tournament together for them for the next 27 years. And then Johnny decided to stop out. He said he had enough of doing it. And I, like an idiot, stayed on. And I ran it until 2018. I ran it actually for 50 years, with the profits of the event going to the WTEF. And then in 2019, we sold the tournament to Mark Ein, an entrepreneur in Washington, who really wanted to build the tournament. I always felt at some point the game had exploded and gotten so big, so popular, so much money all over the world, that a foundation, we were the only foundation that owned a pro tournament event on the tour. And I felt unless they were willing to invest a lot of money and create some new things, build a better stadium, things, that they couldn't compete with the world tour. So they would be better to sell it to somebody who wanted to do that. And Mark has spent a lot of money in Washington in 2019. And then again this year. He couldn't play in 2020 because of the pandemic. But he's done a lot of things to build the event, make it better. And so I think I feel very good about the fact that the WTF has benefited all those years. One of the reasons we did it was that they had funded me when I was on the tour as a junior, when I was trying to play the tour 16, 17, and 18. They had a patrons group that evolved into the WTEF later. and they had given my father $400 a couple summers in a row to let me play junior tournaments. And I never knew that until after I graduated from Yale. My father then told me about it. So I always wanted to give something back to them. I never dreamed that it would become such a big event worldwide as it has become, because the television's been enormous. ATP Tour has done a great job with television. And it's now, as I explained to the Washington Post every year, this isn't a local or regional event. This is an international event. We're in 125 countries all over the world. So I feel very good about that. I feel that it's in good hands with Mark Ein, and I think the WTF is the beneficiary. So in this case, all's well that ends well.
Donald, this was tennis owes you a huge thank you for not only what you've done, but what you continue to do. And your experiences have been amazing. And both Steve and I thank you for spending your evening and walking us through some of them and talking to us about it. Thank you. You are an amazing individual, and like I said, the sport of tennis owes you a big thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I've enjoyed it.